The lookout standing watch on the bridge of U-96 in the North Atlantic on the night of March 16, 1941, had been scanning the horizon for 3 hours when he saw what might have been smoke against the darkness to the northwest, a thin, dark smudge that could have been a cloud or could have been funnel smoke from merchant ships. Matrosenga-Freiter Klaus Schmidt called down the voice pipe to the control room, reporting the possible sighting, understanding that false reports wasted time and fuel investigating contacts that proved to be nothing, but understanding equally that failing to report a genuine contact could mean missing an opportunity to attack a convoy carrying war materials to Britain. Oberleutnant Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock, commanding U-96, came to the bridge immediately to verify the sighting, bringing his own binoculars and scanning the bearing that Schmidt indicated. The Battle of the Atlantic, beginning on September 3, 1939, when Britain declared war on Germany, and extending until May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, represented the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, and the struggle that would determine whether Britain could survive as a base for eventual Allied operations against occupied Europe, or whether Germany would succeed in cutting Britain's maritime supply lines and forcing British surrender through economic strangulation. The battle was fundamentally about merchant shipping, about the cargo vessels carrying food, fuel, raw materials, and war equipment across the Atlantic from North America to Britain, and about the German submarines attempting to sink those ships faster than they could be replaced, while Allied naval forces attempted to protect the convoys and to destroy the U-boats threatening them. Britain imported approximately 55 million tons of goods annually before the war, including approximately half of its food supply, virtually all of its petroleum, most of the raw materials needed for war production, including rubber, metals, and chemicals that could not be produced domestically in quantities needed to sustain a war economy. The dependence on imports meant that disrupting shipping could create shortages that would affect both civilian population and military forces, potentially forcing Britain to negotiate peace if starvation and lack of materials made continuing the war impossible. Winston Churchill, who became Prime Minister in May 1940, understood this vulnerability intimately, later writing that the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was the U-boat peril and the possibility that submarine warfare might succeed where German air attacks and invasion threats had failed. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding the German U-boat force from headquarters that would move from Wilhelmshaven to Paris to Lorient in France as the war progressed, had commanded submarines during World War I and had spent the interwar years developing tactics and strategy for submarine warfare against merchant shipping. Dönitz believed that Britain could be defeated through unrestricted submarine warfare if Germany possessed sufficient submarines operating according to coordinated tactics that he had developed, tactics emphasizing concentration of U-boats into groups that the British would later call wolf packs, which would attack convoys simultaneously from multiple directions, overwhelming escort defenses and sinking large numbers of merchant ships before escorts could respond effectively. The wolf pack concept required that individual U-boat commanders subordinate their independent hunting to coordinated operations directed by shore-based command, with submarines maintaining radio contact to report convoy sightings and to receive instructions about where to concentrate forces for attacks. The radio communications necessary for coordination created vulnerability, because British intelligence could intercept German transmissions and could use direction-finding equipment to locate transmitting submarines, information that could be used to route convoys away from known U-boat positions or to direct anti-submarine forces toward submarines whose locations had been revealed. But Dönitz calculated that the tactical advantages of coordinated attacks outweighed the risks of radio detection, and events during 1940 and 1941 would largely validate his assessment. The German U-boat force, when war began in September 1939, numbered only 57 submarines total, with perhaps 22 to 26 operational at any given time, and the remainder being in port for maintenance, being used for training, or being unsuitable for Atlantic operations due to being small coastal submarines designed for Baltic operations. Dönitz had argued during the pre-war years that Germany needed at least 300 U-boats to conduct effective campaign against British shipping, calculating that approximately 100 submarines would be on patrol at any time if 1/3 were on station, 1/3 were in transit to or from patrol areas, and 1/3 were in port for maintenance and crew rest. But German naval construction priorities had emphasized surface warships, including battleships and cruisers, rather than submarines, reflecting Admiral Erich Raeder's preference for balanced fleet, and reflecting Hitler's initial belief that war with Britain could be avoided. The Type 7 U-boat that would become the workhorse of the German submarine force throughout the war was approximately 220 feet long with beam of approximately 20 feet, displaced approximately 750 tons when surfaced and 850 tons when submerged, and could travel at maximum speed of approximately 17 knots on the surface using 2 diesel engines generating 2,800 horsepower, and approximately 7.6 knots submerged using electric motors powered by batteries. The operational range was approximately 8,500 nautical miles at economical cruising speed of 10 knots on the surface, sufficient to reach patrol areas in the mid-Atlantic from bases in France, to remain on station for several weeks, and to return to base, though actual endurance was typically limited by torpedo supply and by crew endurance rather than by fuel capacity. The crew complement was 44 men, including 4 officers and 40 enlisted personnel, living in conditions that were among the most uncomfortable experienced by any combatants during the war. The interior of a Type 7 submarine was divided into compartments, including the forward torpedo room, containing 4 torpedo tubes and storage for additional torpedoes. The forward crew quarters, where approximately half the crew slept in bunks that were shared between watch sections, with men sleeping in the same bunks at different times. The control room, containing diving controls and navigation equipment, the radio room and sound room, where operators monitored hydrophones listening for enemy ships. The officers' quarters, consisting of tiny cabins, barely large enough for a bunk and a small desk. The galley, where a single cook prepared meals for the entire crew using limited ingredients and minimal cooking facilities. The diesel engine room, containing the massive engines that drove the submarine on the surface. The electric motor room, and the aft torpedo room, containing 1 stern torpedo tube. The conditions during Atlantic patrols that could last 8 to 12 weeks were characterized by extreme crowding, with every available space being used for storage of food, spare parts, and equipment, by humidity that approached 100%, creating condensation that dripped constantly from pipes and bulkheads, by odors from unwashed bodies, from diesel fuel, from bilge water, and from the chemical toilets that were the only sanitation facilities, and by lack of privacy that meant men were constantly in sight of their crewmates, with no opportunity for solitude. Fresh water was severely limited, being reserved primarily for drinking and for cooking, with bathing being impossible during patrols, and with clothes becoming soaked with seawater, sweat, and oil until they were barely wearable but could not be washed or changed because space constraints meant each man carried minimal spare clothing. The food during patrols deteriorated progressively, as fresh provisions were exhausted during the first weeks, and crews subsisted on canned goods, dried foods, and bread that grew moldy in the humid atmosphere, and had to have the mold cut away before being eaten. The cramped conditions meant that food storage was improvised, with provisions being stored in every available space, including under bunks, in the bilges, and hanging from pipes and valves, with the constant movement of the submarine in rough seas, causing stored items to shift and creating hazards when heavy cans or equipment broke loose and became projectiles during violent maneuvers. The crew adapted to these conditions through dark humor, through rigid adherence to watch schedules that provided structure to days that otherwise blended together, in the artificial light of the submarine's interior, and through shared understanding that discomfort was temporary, and that completing the patrol and returning to base meant hot showers, clean clothes, real beds, and leave time that could be spent away from the claustrophobic submarine environment. Lehman Willenbrock confirmed Schmidt's sighting as genuine after studying the smoke through his binoculars for several minutes, concluding that the volume and the pattern suggested multiple ships rather than a single vessel, and that the bearing and movement indicated ships traveling in convoy formation. He ordered the submarine to maintain course toward the smoke while he transmitted a contact report to Donitz's headquarters, giving the convoy's estimated position, course approximately 70 degrees, indicating movement toward Britain, speed estimated at 8 knots, which was typical for convoys limited by the speed of the slowest merchant ships, and composition uncertain, but appearing to be a large convoy based on the amount of smoke visible. The transmission was brief, lasting perhaps 45 seconds as the radio operator keyed the message, using the Enigma machine to encrypt the text before transmission, understanding that British direction-finding stations would detect the transmission and would attempt to locate U-96's position through triangulation of bearings from multiple stations. The risk of revealing the submarine's location was accepted as necessary for coordinating Wolfpack attacks, with Donitz's headquarters needing to know convoy positions so that other U-boats could be directed to intercept, and so that coordinated attacks could be organized. Within hours of receiving U-96's contact report, Donitz's operations staff would be directing other submarines toward the convoy's projected position, creating a concentration of U-boats that would attack during the coming night when darkness would provide cover for surface attacks. The convoy that U-96 had detected was HX-112, consisting of 41 merchant ships that had departed Halifax, Nova Scotia on March 1, 1941, carrying war materials including steel, machinery, aircraft components, ammunition, and food from Canada and from the United States to Britain. The ships varied in size from approximately 4,000 to 12,000 tons, with the larger ships being modern cargo vessels with turbine or diesel engines, and the smaller ships being older coal-fired steamers that produced the heavy smoke that had revealed the convoy's position to U-96's lookout. The convoy was organized into columns approximately 1,000 yards apart, with ships within columns being separated by approximately 500 yards, creating a rectangular formation that covered several square miles of ocean, and that would be difficult for the 7 escort vessels to protect completely against determined submarine attacks. The convoy commodore aboard the merchant ship Auditor was Rear Admiral E.C. Watson, a retired Royal Navy officer who had returned to the service when war began and who was responsible for maintaining convoy formation, for executing any maneuvering orders issued by the escort commander, and for coordinating actions of the merchant ships if the convoy came under attack. Watson's authority extended only to the merchant vessels and did not include the naval escorts whose commander, Captain Donald McIntyre, aboard the destroyer HMS Walker, made tactical decisions about how to defend the convoy and about how to respond to submarine contacts. The division of authority between convoy commodore and escort commander sometimes created confusion, but generally, the system worked with merchant ships following the Commodore's signals regarding station keeping and maneuvering, while escorts operated independently under their commander's direction. The escort for convoy HX-112 consisted of 5 destroyers, including HMS Walker, HMS Vanek, HMS Sardonyx, HMS Scimitar, and HMS Volunteer, plus 2 corvettes HMS Bluebell and HMS Hydrangea, representing relatively strong escort by standards of early 1941, when many convoys sailed with fewer escorts and when some convoys in less critical routes traveled with minimal protection or even without escorts. The destroyers were World War I-era vessels that had been built during 1917 to 1919 and that had been modernized during the 1930s with updated weapons and sensors, but that lacked the endurance and the sea-keeping qualities that would characterize destroyers designed specifically for Atlantic escort duty. The corvettes were newly built vessels based on whaling ship designs, small ships of approximately 900 tons that could operate in Atlantic weather, but that rolled heavily in rough seas, making them uncomfortable platforms for their crews. The primary anti-submarine weapon carried by the escorts was the depth charge, a cylindrical canister containing approximately 300 pounds of explosive that could be set to detonate at specific depths ranging from 50 feet to 500 feet, with the detonation creating a pressure wave that could crush a submarine's hull if the charge exploded within approximately 20 feet, or that could cause leaks, equipment damage, and casualties if it exploded within perhaps 50 to 100 feet. The escorts carried between 30 and 70 depth charges depending on vessel type and on how much modification had been done to increase storage capacity, with depth charges being launched from racks on the stern that allowed charges to roll off while the ship was moving forward, or from throwers on the sides that could launch charges approximately 40 yards to port or starboard. The ASDIC sonar system that escorts used to detect submerged submarines transmitted sound pulses into the water and detected echoes returning from objects including submarines, fish schools, whale pods, thermal layers, and wrecks on the ocean floor, with operators attempting to distinguish genuine submarine contacts from the many false contacts that ASDIC detected under operational conditions. The effective range of ASDIC was approximately 500 yards under ideal conditions, with calm seas and favorable water temperature and salinity characteristics. But often the effective range was much less when conditions were poor, when sea state created noise that masked echoes, or when thermal layers reflected sound pulses away from targets at different depths. The ASDIC could not detect submarines on the surface, creating a significant limitation when U-boats attacked at night while surfaced, and lost contact when the attacking ship passed directly over a submerged submarine, creating a dead zone where no echoes could be received during the final approach for depth charge attack. Captain McIntyre received warning from Western Approach's command that U-boat activity had been detected in his convoy's area based on direction-finding bearings from U-96's transmission, though the warning could not provide precise location because triangulation from multiple direction-finding stations gave only approximate position within perhaps 50 to 100 miles. McIntyre ordered his escorts to increase vigilance, to maintain continuous ASDIC sweeps ahead and on the flanks of the convoy, and to investigate any suspicious contacts aggressively rather than waiting to confirm that contacts were genuine submarines before responding. The increased vigilance could not prevent determined submarines from attacking, but it might detect U-boats attempting to reach attack positions and might force them to submerge where their speed would be reduced and where they would have difficulty maintaining contact with the convoy. The wolf pack that assembled to attack Convoy HX-112 during March 15th-17th included U-99 commanded by Kapitän Leutnant Otto Kretschmer, U-100 commanded by Kapitän Leutnant Joachim Schepke, U-37, U-74, U-110, U-A, and U-96, representing 7 submarines that Donitz's operations staff had directed toward the convoy based on U-96's contact report and on the convoy's projected track. The U-boat commanders received instructions to concentrate near the convoy's estimated position and to attack during darkness on March 16th and 17th, with each commander being free to maneuver independently for attacks, but with the expectation that simultaneous attacks would overwhelm escorts and create opportunities for multiple submarines to penetrate the convoy formation. Kretschmer in U-99 was the most successful U-boat commander of the war to that point, having sunk 43 ships totaling approximately 260,000 tons during patrols between September 1939 and March 1941, a record that exceeded all other U-boat commanders and that had earned him the Knight's Cross with Oak Leaves, one of Germany's highest military decorations. Kretschmer's tactics emphasized surface attacks at night when U-boats were nearly invisible against the dark ocean and when their surface speed of 17 knots gave them maneuverability advantage over merchant ships traveling at 8 to 10 knots in convoy formation. He preferred to penetrate inside convoy formations where he could fire at multiple targets from close range before escorts could locate and attack him, accepting the risks of operating among merchant ships and escorts in exchange for the higher probability of hits and the confusion that attacks from inside the convoy created among defenders trying to locate the attacking submarine. Schepke in U-100 was another highly successful commander, having sunk 36 ships totaling approximately 155,000 tons and having received the Knight's Cross with Oak Leaves in recognition of his achievements. Schepke's approach differed from Kretschmer's in that he preferred to attack from outside the convoy formation, firing spreads of torpedoes at ships on the convoy's edge, and then withdrawing before escorts could respond, accepting lower hit probability in exchange for reduced risk of being caught inside the convoy where escape routes might be blocked. The different tactical approaches reflected different personalities and different assessments of acceptable risk, but both commanders had proven their methods effective through months of successful operations against British convoys. The attack on Convoy HX-112 began during the night of March 15th-16th when Kretschmer in U-99 approached the convoy on the surface, maneuvering through rough seas that made observation difficult, but that also reduced the likelihood of being spotted by escort lookouts. Kretschmer had studied the convoy's formation during the hours before dark, identifying the columns and estimating the positions of escorts, planning an approach that would bring him into the convoy from astern, where escorts were typically fewer, because escorts concentrated on the flanks and ahead, where submarines were expected to attack from. The approach took several hours as U-99 crept toward the convoy at reduced speed to minimize wake and noise, with Kretschmer on the bridge personally conning the submarine while lookouts scanned constantly for escorts that might detect the submarine's presence. The penetration into the convoy formation occurred around 22:30 hours when U-99 passed between 2 columns of merchant ships, the dark silhouette of the submarine being nearly invisible against the black ocean and the sound of the submarine's diesels being masked by the noise from merchant ship engines and by the sounds of rough seas. Kretschmer selected his first target, a merchant ship estimated at 8,000 tons that was steaming in the middle of one column, closed to range of approximately 700 yards to ensure hits, and fired a spread of 3 torpedoes from the bow tubes at intervals of 5 seconds. The torpedoes left wakes of luminescence that were visible from the submarine, but that were difficult to see from merchant ships where lookouts were focused on maintaining station in convoy rather than on watching for torpedo wakes. The first torpedo hit the merchant ship Inger Elizabeth near the engine room, the explosion tearing open the hull and flooding machinery spaces that contained the engines and boilers, stopping the ship almost immediately and causing it to begin settling by the stern as water poured through the hole. The second torpedo missed ahead of the target, continuing through the convoy and eventually running out of fuel and sinking. The third torpedo hit near the forward cargo holds, detonating among cargo that included ammunition and creating a secondary explosion that broke the ship's back and caused it to sink within minutes. The crew had no time to launch lifeboats properly, with some men jumping into the water and others being trapped aboard as the ship went down. The survivors in the water, facing the grim reality that water temperature of approximately 40 degrees Fahrenheit gave them perhaps 30 minutes before hypothermia would kill them if they were not rescued. Kretschmer reloaded the bow tubes while maneuvering inside the convoy, selecting another target while lookouts reported that escorts appeared to be moving toward the position where Inger Elizabeth had been hit, investigating the attack but not having located U-99's position. The second attack hit the merchant ship J.B. White, a 5,000-ton freighter carrying steel and machinery, with one torpedo striking amidships and causing catastrophic flooding. The third attack hit the Norwegian tanker Bedouin carrying aviation fuel, with the torpedo detonation igniting the cargo and creating a massive fireball that illuminated the convoy and that allowed Kretschmer to see the entire formation clearly for several minutes, while the burning ship created artificial daylight across several square miles of ocean. The escorts responded to the attacks by firing star shells that burst high above the convoy and descended slowly on parachutes, illuminating the ocean surface with harsh white light that escorts hoped would reveal surface submarines. HMS Walker detected a surface submarine on radar at range of approximately 3,000 yards and turned toward it at maximum speed, but the contact proved to be U-100 under Shepka rather than U-99, with Shepka crash diving to avoid the charging destroyer. HMS Vanek obtained ASDIC contact on the diving U-100 and attacked with depth charges, dropping a pattern of 5 charges set to explode at 150 and 300 feet, the detonations creating enormous geysers of water that rose 100 feet into the air and creating pressure waves that rattled equipment aboard Vanek half a mile from the explosions. U-100 was damaged by the depth charge attack, with explosions rupturing pipes and causing leaks in the pressure hull that the crew struggled to control, with electrical systems failing as seawater shorted circuits, and with the submarine's ability to maneuver being compromised by damage to diving planes and rudder. Shepka attempted to escape by going deep, diving below 500 feet where the submarine's hull was stressed beyond design limits and where pressure could cause catastrophic implosion if the Yari hull failed, but the leaks worsened at greater depth and the submarine could not maintain trim with the damage it had sustained. The decision to surface was forced on Shepka by circumstances rather than being a tactical choice, with the submarine's batteries being depleted and with the crew facing death from chlorine gas created by seawater, mixing with battery acid if they remained submerged. UE-100 surfaced approximately 400 yards ahead of HMS Vanek, which was turning for another depth charge attack, with Shepka on the bridge, attempting to assess damage and attempting to maneuver away from the destroyer when he realized that collision was imminent. Vanek's commander had not seen the submarine surface and was maintaining course toward the last ASDIC contact when lookouts spotted the submarine directly ahead, too close to avoid, and with the destroyer's momentum carrying it forward into the submarine, despite attempts to reverse engines. The collision occurred at approximately 300 hours on March 17th, with Vanek's bow striking U-100's conning tower and crushing it along with Shepka, who was still on the bridge attempting to order crash dive when the destroyer hit. The submarine sank immediately with the majority of the crew still aboard, the survivors being 6 men who had been on deck when the collision occurred and who were thrown into the water by the impact, being rescued by British sailors from Vanek, who threw ropes and lifebuoys, despite the risk that the submarine might explode or that other submarines might attack the stationary destroyer. The rescue of the German survivors took approximately 15 minutes, with the men being pulled aboard more dead than alive from cold and from shock, being taken below for medical treatment and being given hot drinks and blankets before being secured as prisoners. The interrogation would come later, after the survivors had recovered sufficiently to answer questions, but the immediate priority was saving lives, even though those lives belonged to enemies who had been attempting to sink British ships just minutes before. The sinking of U-100 and the death of Shepka represented a significant victory for the escorts, but Kretschmer in U-99 was still operating inside the convoy and was still sinking ships, having torpedoed 2 more merchant ships while the escorts were engaged with U-100. Kretschmer's 5th victim of the night was the tanker Firm, carrying fuel oil that ignited when the torpedo hit, creating another massive fire that illuminated the convoy and that provided Kretschmer with clear views of additional targets. The 6th ship torpedoed was the cargo vessel Venetia, hit by a single torpedo that detonated in cargo holds containing explosives and ammunition, the secondary explosions from the cargo being so violent that debris from the ship rained down on other merchant ships hundreds of yards away. Captain McIntyre, aboard HMS Walker, had been directing the escort's response to the attacks, coordinating searches for submarines while attempting to maintain protection for the merchant ships that were continuing to advance in convoy formation despite the attacks occurring around them. McIntyre understood that the attacks were coming from inside the convoy formation based on the angles of torpedo tracks and based on the fact that merchant ships in the middle of the convoy were being hit rather than ships on the edges where submarines attacking from outside would hit first. The realization that a submarine was operating inside the convoy created tactical dilemma, because aggressive depth charge attacks inside the convoy risked hitting merchant ships with depth charges or with gunfire, while passive response allowed the submarine to continue attacking. The decision to hunt the submarine aggressively despite the risks was made by McIntyre after the 6th merchant ship was torpedoed, with Walker turning into the convoy formation and beginning systematic search using ASDIC, while ordering merchant ships to maintain course and speed regardless of what happened around them. The ASDIC operator aboard Walker obtained contact on a submerged submarine at range of approximately 100 to 200 yards, reporting the bearing and range, while McIntyre conned the ship toward the contact and prepared depth charge attack. The submarine was U-99, which had submerged after exhausting bow torpedoes and while reloading tubes, with Kretschmer intending to resume surface attacks once reloading was complete. The depth charge attack was delivered by Walker, making an attack run over the submarine's estimated position, dropping a pattern of 10 depth charges set to explode at 150 and 250 feet based on estimates of the submarine's depth from ASDIC returns. The explosions occurred in sequence as charges reached their preset depths, creating massive underwater detonations that were felt aboard U-99 as hammer blows that threw crewmen to the deck, that shattered light bulbs and gauges, and that created terror among the crew who understood that death could come at any moment if the hull failed or if critical systems were damaged beyond the crew's ability to repair. The damage to U-99 from the depth charge attack was severe but not immediately fatal, with the pressure hull remaining intact, but with numerous systems being damaged, including hydraulic systems controlling diving planes, electrical systems including lighting and pumps, and the air conditioning system that removed carbon dioxide from the air, allowing the crew to breathe. Kretschmer ordered emergency repairs while attempting to evade further attacks by changing depth and course, but the damage to diving controls made precise maneuvering difficult, and the submarine was leaving an oil trail from ruptured fuel tanks that Walker's lookout spotted on the surface, marking the submarine's position. The second depth charge attack occurred approximately 15 minutes after the first, with Walker having maneuvered for another attack run while maintaining ASDIC contact despite the submarine's evasive maneuvers. This attack was more accurate than the first, with at least 2 depth charges exploding within perhaps 30 feet of the submarine's hull, close enough that the pressure waves caused additional damage, including cracking battery casings and allowing seawater to mix with battery acid, creating chlorine gas that began filling the submarine's interior. The gas was deadly, attacking lungs and eyes and creating choking sensations that led to panic among some crew members who understood that remaining submerged with gas filling the submarine meant certain death. Kretschmer made the decision to surface after assessing the damage and recognizing that the submarine could not remain submerged with chlorine gas spreading through the boat and with batteries failing, meaning that electric motors would soon be unable to provide power for maneuvering or for operating pumps essential to controlling flooding. The decision to surface was announced calmly to avoid creating panic, with orders being given to prepare to abandon ship and to bring confidential materials, including code books and Enigma machine rotors, to the bridge for disposal before surrendering to avoid these materials being captured. The crew understood what surfacing meant, that they would be surrendering to the British after having sunk 6 ships during the night's attacks, but they also understood that the alternative was dying in the submarine when it became unable to surface or when chlorine gas killed them. U-99 surfaced approximately 1,000 yards from HMS Walker at 0330 hours on March 17th, with the destroyer immediately illuminating the submarine with searchlights and opening fire with the 4-inch gun on the foredeck, scoring hits on the submarine's conning tower and hull. Kretschmer ordered the crew to abandon ship immediately, with men pouring out of hatches onto the deck, while he remained on the bridge destroying confidential materials and opening vents to scuttle the submarine, ensuring it would sink rather than being captured intact. The crew jumped into the water wearing life jackets, the lucky ones being picked up within minutes by boats from Walker, while others spent longer in the freezing water before being rescued or dying from hypothermia before rescue arrived. Kretschmer was the last man off U-99, jumping into the water just before the submarine's bow rose into the air and the stern sank, the submarine sliding beneath the surface and disappearing into the depths, taking with it the records of Kretschmer's successful patrol career and removing from action the U-boat force's most successful commander. Kretschmer was rescued by British sailors approximately 5 minutes after entering the water, being pulled aboard more dead than alive from cold and from exhaustion, being revived with blankets and hot tea before being taken below, where he was identified by British officers who recognized him from intelligence files, showing photographs and descriptions of known U-boat commanders. The capture of Kretschmer was a major intelligence coup, providing opportunities for interrogation that would reveal information about U-boat tactics, about training, and about conditions within the U-boat force. The convoy battle that had seen U-99 and U-100 sunk and had seen Kretschmer and Shepka removed from combat continued for another night as other U-boats from the Wolfpack attempted attacks, But the escort's aggressive response and the loss of 2 submarines had disrupted German coordination and had demonstrated that convoy defense was becoming more effective as escorts gained experience and as equipment improved. The total losses from convoy HX-112 were 5 merchant ships sunk totaling approximately 31,000 tons, significant losses, but not the catastrophic destruction that might have occurred if Kretschmer and Schepke had been able to continue attacking throughout the night without being sunk. The exchange rate of 5 merchant ships for 2 U-boats, including 2 of Germany's best commanders, represented a tactical victory for the convoy defense, though the strategic situation remained precarious with merchant ship losses continuing to exceed replacement rates during 1941. The year 1941 represented a period of relatively balanced fortunes in the Battle of the Atlantic, with U-boats sinking approximately 432 merchant ships totaling approximately 2.1 million tons while suffering losses of 35 submarines, numbers that indicated the battle could go either way depending on whether Germany could increase U-boat production and whether Britain could develop more effective convoy defenses and could build merchant ships faster than they were being sunk. The entry of the United States into the war in December 1941 after Pearl Harbor would transform the strategic balance by providing access to American shipyards and to American industrial capacity. Though in the near term, American entry would create new opportunities for U-boats to attack inadequately protected American coastal shipping. The second happy time, as German submariners called the period from January through August 1942, when they operated off the American East Coast, saw U-boats achieving success that exceeded even the favorable conditions of 1940, when Britain had stood alone and when convoy defenses had been minimal. The American Navy's failure to implement convoy procedures immediately when war began, combined with American coastal cities' refusal to enforce blackout procedures, meaning that ships were silhouetted against brightly lit shorelines, created conditions allowing U-boats to sink ships almost at will with minimal risk. Kapitänleutnant Reinhard Hartigan, commanding U-123 during Operation Drumbeat in January 1942, sank 9 ships totaling approximately 53,000 tons during his first patrol off the American coast, attacking ships that were sailing independently without escorts and that were making no attempts at evasion or at anti-submarine precautions. The scenes off American beaches during early 1942 were remarkable, with people on shore being able to see ships burning after being torpedoed, with debris and bodies washing up on beaches creating public alarm, and with U-boats occasionally surfacing in daylight within sight of shore to navigate using coastal landmarks. The American Navy's response was hampered by shortage of escort vessels because most American destroyers had been assigned to Atlantic convoy duty or to Pacific operations, by reluctance of American shipping companies to accept convoy procedures that would slow deliveries and reduce profits, and by divided command arrangements that prevented effective coordination between Navy, Army, and Coast Guard forces responsible for coastal defense. The implementation of convoy procedures along the American East Coast, beginning in May 1942, would gradually reduce U-boat successes, with losses declining once merchant ships began sailing in protected groups rather than independently. The total Allied merchant shipping losses during 1942 reached approximately 1,060 ships sunk totaling approximately 6.3 million tons, the peak year for U-boat successes and the year that came closest to achieving Donitz's goal of sinking ships faster than they could be replaced. The losses created genuine crisis for Allied war planning, because accumulated losses were reducing the total tonnage available for transporting troops and supplies, because shipbuilding programs had not yet reached full production rates that would characterize 1943 and 1944, and because plans for eventual invasion of Europe required massive buildup of forces and supplies in Britain that could not occur if shipping losses continued at 1942 rates. Churchill's concern about the U-boat peril was at its highest during 1942, with serious consideration being given to whether resources should be diverted from strategic bombing of Germany to anti-submarine operations, and to whether invasion of Europe would need to be delayed until shipping situation improved. The turning point came during spring 1943, when multiple factors combined to shift the balance decisively in favor of convoy defense, factors including the closing of the mid-Atlantic air gap through deployment of very long-range aircraft and through introduction of escort carriers that could provide air cover throughout convoy routes, improvements in radar technology allowing detection of surface submarines at night and in poor visibility, increase in numbers of escort vessels as British and American shipyards delivered destroyers and corvettes designed specifically for Atlantic escort duty, and intelligence advantages from ultra-decryption of German Enigma communications, providing detailed information about U-boat positions and intentions. The combination of these improvements created conditions where U-boat losses began exceeding replacement rates, while merchant ship losses declined to sustainable levels. Convoy ONS-5, crossing the Atlantic during late April and early May 1943, became focal point for one of the decisive battles when approximately 30 U-boats concentrated to attack the convoy, consisting of 43 merchant ships escorted by British and Canadian escorts. The battle lasted approximately 1 week from April 28th to May 6th, with U-boats making repeated attacks during darkness while escorts hunted submarines and while aircraft from Iceland and from escort carrier HMS Biter provided air cover. The U-boats sank 13 merchant ships during the battle, but lost 7 submarines to escorts and aircraft, an exchange rate that was clearly unsustainable for Germany, given that merchant ship construction now exceeded losses while U-boat construction could not replace losses if casualty rates remained at May 1943 levels. The crisis within the German Naval High Command following the losses during May 1943, when 43 U-boats were sunk in a single month, led Dönitz to withdraw submarines temporarily from the North Atlantic, while considering how to counter Allied anti-submarine capabilities that had become so effective. The options were limited, with technological solutions, including acoustic homing torpedoes and Schnorkel breathing devices, offering some improvements, but not fundamentally changing the tactical situation where Allied advantages in numbers, in radar, in intelligence, and in air power had become overwhelming. The decision to return U-boats to Atlantic operations during summer 1943 with Schnorkel-equipped submarines reflected determination to continue the campaign, despite unfavorable conditions, accepting higher losses in hope that improved technology would reduce vulnerability and would allow some level of continued success against Allied shipping. The final phase of the Battle of the Atlantic during 1944-1945 saw U-boats operating under conditions where survival was primary concern rather than achieving significant sinkings, with submarines being hunted continuously by aircraft and surface forces equipped with technologies that made detection nearly certain. The Type 21 submarine, representing German attempts to develop submarines that could operate effectively against Allied anti-submarine capabilities, entered production during 1944 with revolutionary design featuring high submerged speed exceeding 15 knots, large battery capacity allowing extended submerged operations, and improved sensors and weapons. But the Type 01 program was delayed by Allied bombing of German shipyards and by resource shortages, with only a handful becoming operational before war ended and none achieving significant operational success. The statistics of the Battle of the Atlantic demonstrate its scale and its cost, with approximately 300 merchant ships totaling approximately 14.5 million tons being sunk by U-boats during the war, approximately 175 Allied warships being sunk, and approximately 30,000 merchant seamen being killed. The German losses totaled approximately 785 U-boats sunk from all causes and approximately 30,000 submariners killed from approximately 40,000 who served, representing casualty rate of approximately 75% that made U-boat service one of the most dangerous military assignments of the entire war. The longest continuous military campaign of World War II demonstrated how industrial capacity, technological innovation, and intelligence capabilities could determine outcomes as much as tactical skill or operational excellence, with Germany's failure to cut Britain's maritime supply lines, allowing Britain to survive and to serve as base for Allied liberation of Europe.